and welcome to Western Civ, episode 240, Montezuma and Cortés. Last time, Cortés and his band of conquistadors, plus lots of Native American allies, made it from the coast to the heart of Tenochtitlan itself. In doing so, Cortés directly violated the orders given to him by Governor Velasquez. In order to stave off any reckoning, Cortés sent his own mission directly to Spain, with instructions to get post facto recognition for his efforts. The problem was, what exactly had he done so far? Sure, he had made it all the way to the Mexica capital. That alone was quite the accomplishment. He had, reapportioned, I guess, a not insignificant amount of gold and silver. He had allied himself with several powerful Mesoamerican allies. But the Mexica Empire was very much independent and intact. If Montezuma chose to kill Cortés now, he'd be a minor footnote to history. Cortés truly becomes the Cortés we all know from history because of what is going to happen in today's episode. Today, Cortés really starts gambling. If the night of November the 8th was unusually quiet in Tenochtitlan, the morning was business as usual. An early riser might have noticed young boys hurrying to the Great Pyramid with coals for the braziers, or girls carrying tortillas for the priests to eat. Merchants from far away would have been slowly arriving to the markets in their canoes. For the moment, the citizens of Tenochtitlan met all the conquistadors' needs. This wasn't a small thing. There were hundreds of conquistadors, plus a few thousand men from Tlaxcala. For a pre-modern society, feeding that number of people was not simple. But they did it. The Europeans feasted on tortillas, turkeys, and fresh eggs. Their horses were fed and bedded down. Even their dogs were taken care of. For the moment, the Mexica did this without resentment. For the moment. Cortés and his followers spent the next several days resting and seeing the sights. Cortés didn't know what his next step should be. Quote unquote, take Montezuma dead or alive. Sounds all well and good while he and his followers had been safe and sound on the coast. Suddenly, surrounded by Mexica and the knowledge that Montezuma might at any moment order the drawbridges raised, Cortés was suddenly a lot less sure. Cortés soon found out how large the city was, how it was divided into 4 quarters, how large avenues meeting in the central square separated these districts, how each quarter had its own main temple, the headquarters of the district governors, and how these districts themselves divided into smaller zones. But Cortés was slower to discover the size of the full Montezuma's empire. He knew that it had reached the Gulf of Mexico, but he took some time to appreciate that it extended to what they thought of as, quote-unquote, the Southern Sea. He thought that the territory was nearly as big as Spain, a calculation which overestimated the enterprise. For the Empire of Mexico was about 125,000 square miles, in comparison with Spain's size of 300,000. But the total area with a culture comparable to that of Old Mexico, that is, including places like Tlaxcala and the Yucatan, would have given this new world 500,000 square miles. That next day, Montezuma received Cortés in his palace. He treated Cortés with deference, kind of like one might expect for a foreign dignitary. Cortés, through his translator, Marina, obviously, then gave the usual speech about the values of Christianity. Montezuma listened through the finer points of Christianity, though they were probably a bit lost on him. At the end of the first meeting, the two men just took their leave of one another. It's probably hard to say who left the room more perplexed. Now, it's worth noting briefly here just how crucial Marina was to Cortés. Now, to him, this was a bad thing. Cortés did not like how dependent he was on his female interpreter. And the female part is important in that sentence. The fact that Cortés was dependent on anyone irked him. That he was dependent on a teenage girl drove him absolutely nuts. Without Marina, however, Cortés never could have succeeded. In fact, it soon became clear that Marina had what we would call a gift for language, as she soon began to learn Spanish as well. Now, after the amazement of seeing the city for the first time wore off, the captains and several of those from the Tlaxcalans, many of whom seemed to have been in Tenochtitlan, came to see Cortés. They told him that he would never be able to escape the city and carry off all the jewels and gold of which they had already been given. They further warned that the Mexica were most likely planning to kill him. Several Spaniards began to talk of being caught in a spider's web. One of the men, a certain Ordaz, said that he had seen from the roof how easily the Mexica could cut off their retreat simply by raising the drawbridges. In fact, looking south from the roof of the palace, Cortés would have noted that the Mexica had already raised one or two of the bridges on the causeway. All the same, Cortés was probably still mulling over a direct attack on Montezuma when some bad news arrived from the coast. While he had been gone, the normal Mexica envoy showed up demanding tribute. This was nothing out of the ordinary. Juan de Escalante, however, the man Cortés had left in charge, refused to pay the tribute on behalf of his Totonac allies. Perplexed, the envoys left. Frankly, the whole affair probably should have ended right there. But Escalante decided he would try to push the issue. He sallied forth and met the envoys with their troops outside town, demanding gold, sort of flipping the script. The representative said they didn't have any gold, which, for the record, they didn't. Still, Escalante decided to make an example of these men and attacked. During the fighting, Escalante's allies deserted him. He managed to retreat and burn a nearby town for good measure, but was mortally wounded and died shortly thereafter. While this was certainly bad news for Cortés, he decided to take these lemons and make lemonade. He would use the incident as a pretext for demanding a crucial audience with Montezuma. Cortés went to see Montezuma on November the 14th, 1519. He took several captains with him and about 30 other armed men. On arrival in the throne room, Cortés began to banter with Montezuma as he usually did. The emperor, who didn't sense anything out of the ordinary, offered Cortés some jewels, and even one of his daughters. In fact, he proposed several noblemen's daughters for Cortés's men. Cortés turned these down, and he always turned down these offers, by the way, claiming that he couldn't take a consort who wasn't baptized. Cortés then changed the subject sharply and said that he was astonished that Montezuma would even send captains against the garrison which he, Cortés, had left at Veracruz. He, Cortés, had done everything possible to help Montezuma, but now the opposite of what he had desired had transpired. Precisely the same chain of events had occurred at Cholula, he observed icily. Remember, by the way, he slaughtered all the leaders at Cholula. Cortés said that he was willing to forgive everything if Montezuma would accompany him, without making a scene, to the European lodgings. But if he were to cry out or make any noise at all, then his captains would immediately kill him. Montezuma was terrified. At this point, he was caught between a rock and a hard place. Certainly, he didn't want to be killed right then and there, but he recognized that him being a prisoner was problematic. He said, quote, "My person is not such that I can be made a prisoner of, even if I would like it. My people would not suffer it." End quote. An argument ensued that actually lasted most of the day. And why somebody doesn't, bust in and help Montezuma at this point, I'm not really sure. But at some point, the various European captains, and the record's murky as to who, but they start to get nervous that something's going to happen. And they realize that they've got to get Montezuma out right now and back to their own lodgings, which they can barricade, or they're going to be badly outnumbered where they were. Now, Montezuma was still trying to get out of this. He proposed his son and 2 daughters as hostages. I mean, what would his counselors say if he was taken away as a prisoner? But Cortés was insistent. He said that there was no alternative. The emperor had to come with them. Montezuma would have to stay with the Europeans until they could get to the bottom of what had happened at Veracruz. In the meantime, Cortés told him, Montezuma would be able to carry out the administration of his empire from the lodgings of the European at the palace of Axatal. Montezuma ultimately agreed to go with Cortés. He told his men to stand down, that he had consulted with the gods and decided, for his health, to spend a few days with Cortés. Now, the guards outright asked Montezuma if they just wanted them to kill Cortés and his men right then and there. He told them no. Cortés had just taken captive the most important man in the Mexica world. It was an enormous coup for Cortés, and his actions were very much in keeping with the Renaissance notion that great men could accomplish great things if they were willing to risk a lot. Now, Montezuma quickly became accustomed to his jailers. I suppose today we would probably diagnose him with Stockholm Syndrome, though certainly no one thought that at the time. I should point out, from the records that we have, and most of them are Spanish records, but from what we do have, Montezuma did genuinely seem to like Cortés. Cortés and many of the other Europeans made him laugh. He especially liked a young page named Orteguilla, who knew Spanish and had learned a little Natal. In addition to all the jokes, Cortés would lecture Montezuma daily, and probably endlessly, about the nature of Christian theology, especially the relationship between the Trinity. One has to imagine that part of Montezuma's day was a lot less humorous. Jokes and lectures aside, Montezuma's capture was a huge crisis for the Mexica Empire. The emperor was essential to the direction of Mexican society. He was supposed to speak directly on behalf of the gods. Now he was someone's captive. What did this mean for the proper order of things? What did it mean for the functioning of Mexica society and their government? Certainly, there would have been many anxious people in Tenochtitlan that fall. Adding to the anxiety, the Mexica official who had engaged in battle with Escalante and several men who fought with him were brought to Tenochtitlan as prisoners. Montezuma weakly handed these men over to Cortés. At first, the official denied that Montezuma had anything to do with the incident. But then, under torture, he changed his tune. Still, Cortés told Montezuma, while he was within his rights to have Montezuma put to death then and there, he was so fond of him that he would never dream of having anyone harm him. Then he turned around and had the official from Veracruz and all his sons burned at the stake before the Great Pyramid. This technique of varying supposed kindness with naked brutality kept Montezuma off balance and secured his continued cooperation. Shortly thereafter, Cortés removed the iron shackles keeping the Mexican emperor in place. He told Montezuma he was free to go. But perhaps afraid of how his people now perceived him, Montezuma chose to stay with Cortés. For some weeks yet, Montezuma at least seemed to rule. The city returned to something like normality. Nightly dancing and singing continued in the temples. The law courts issued judgments. The regular, ordinary life of the Mexicans continued. Montezuma also continued making sacrifices. Cortés wrote in his journal about how much he hated this, but he couldn't do anything about it for the moment. So he just pretended not to notice. I'd have to imagine that's hard. I've never been to a human sacrifice, and I hope never to be. But I'd have to think it's hard to pretend not to notice one going on. Despite outward appearances, Montezuma's own character had changed. He was no longer the proud and ruthless Mexican Empire. He was now pliable, undecided, and subservient, if perhaps underneath, subtle and trustworthy. He passed the days with Cortés as a young boy might pass the days with a doting grandfather. Cortés played Mexican games with Montezuma, which, as an aside, Cortés seems to have really enjoyed. Cortés tried to teach Montezuma as much as he could about Spanish customs. He even showed him how to use a crossbow, something that delighted Montezuma endlessly. In his journal, Cortés wrote about Montezuma in fond terms. Montezuma returned the gesture, describing how he, quote, loved Cortés like a brother. Around the same time, Cortés decided he would have a series of boats constructed to be able to take, quote, 300 men and horses to the mainland, end quote. Remember, the Mexicans could always pull up the drawbridges on the causeway and trap the Spaniards on the island. Cortés wanted to take away this trump card. So in November, he decided to have several boats built to ameliorate this disadvantage. The Mexican Empire during most of this period continued to function normally. Tribute flowed, long-distance trade continued. As Cortés himself put it, quote, harmony and order was maintained. But all good things must come to an end. I should put good in air quotes there, I guess. In this case, the cause of the conflict that would lead to significant bloodshed in the streets of Tenochtitlan were two tales as old as time: religion and gold. The fight over religion derived, as you probably expected, from the issue of sacrifice. Cortés wanted to bring the practice to an end, but to this point he hadn't been successful. He also wanted to put a crucifix and a picture of the Virgin Mary at the summit of the Great Temple. This hadn't happened either. As for the gold, Cortés continued to press Montezuma as to the location of his gold mines. The emperor did allow Cortés access to some of the tribute books, showing which parts of the empire paid their taxes in gold. Quote, in Montezuma's income books, we looked up which were the provinces from which he drew gold as tribute, and where there were mines, cacao, and cotton cloaks. End quote. It's, of course, worth noting that gold meant a lot less to the Mexica than it did to the Spanish. That being said, Montezuma was no fool. He certainly did not disclose to the Europeans the location of all of his gold mines. Some he kept secret. To the regions Montezuma did disclose, Cortés sent expeditions of men to determine the value of the mines. If he was going to steal the wealth of old Mexico, he might as well do a full accounting first. While this was going on, Cortés continued working to consolidate his power. In early January 1520, Cortés had Montezuma summon all the great Mexican lords to Tenochtitlan for an audience. Now, what happened at this meeting is all according to Cortés, so we need to take it with a grain of salt. But with that being said, here's what, according to him, happened. Cortés gave a lengthy speech in which he detailed how lucky everyone was to have lived at a time when they could all come under the glorious sovereignty of the King of Castile, Charles V. And, luckily, they could all become Christians in time to save their souls. How fortunate for them. According to Cortés, their response to all this was nothing less than complete adulation and subjugation. Evidently, the assembled nobles immediately understood how everything Cortés said was correct, and there was no point in arguing. Case closed. My guess is that this is how Cortés chose to interpret what he saw. In any event, the nobility was not about to question Montezuma to his face, at least not yet. So the emperor and the nobility turned over children, sons and daughters, as I suppose hostages. The upshot of all this for Cortés was that he could claim Montezuma had now formally accepted Charles V as his lord and emperor. What this meant was that Cortés could interpret any new expedition Velázquez might send against him as against the king himself, since Montezuma was now a lawful vassal. It gave Cortés a stronger moral position, and at least in theory, a stronger legal one. But the religious disputes remained. Montezuma offered up the idea of a kind of compromise. Perhaps, he suggested, they put the Mexican gods on one side of the shrine and the Christian god on the other. Evidently, Montezuma had not listened to my episodes on the Reformation. Had he would have known that the 16th century was not known for being an era of religious compromise. No, Cortés stood firm. The idols had to go. So several days later, the Mexican priests put together ropes, pulleys, and other contraptions to get the Mexican gods out of the shrine and safely down to the ground. It took all day, but it worked. After the Mexican idols were gone, Cortés had the shrines cleaned and the effigies of the Virgin Mary and Saint Christopher installed atop the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. Saint Christopher was a major patron saint during the Middle Ages, so that's why he ended up there. Then, finally, per Cortés's order, the sacrifices stopped. He would report later of this time, quote, "In all the time that I remained in the city, I did not see a single living creature killed or sacrificed." I should note the obvious qualification that he put on that. I did not see. What went on outside his realm of vision? Well, I guess we'll never know. One thing Cortés certainly did see was gold. Lots of gold. In the early part of 1520, Cortés and the expedition as a whole held basically a financial accounting, a stocking. The gold which had been gained, both from the presents and from items seized, was valued at 160,000 pesos. The royal fifth, therefore, was named as 32,000 pesos. This was exclusive of gold and silver jewelry, which must have been worth at least 75,000 pesos or more. So then a fifth of the remainder of the first amount of gold, 128,000 pesos, which Cortés took for himself, would have been about 25,600. That left 102,400 pesos worth of gold to distribute. But Cortés claimed he had to reimburse himself for his expenses, including sailors' wages, the ships, the food, the horses. Money also had to be allocated to the 2 priests on the expedition, to Cortés's agents in Spain, and 70 men left behind at Veracruz. These subtractions left little to be divided. Some money, in fact, was distributed. 1 or 2 soldiers seemed to have been satisfied. Ordinary soldiers got about 100 pesos, and most of them looked at this as an insult. Now, Cortés was able to smooth it over with a lot of them, the few secret, sort of under-the-table payments. All the estimates were arrived at after the gold, by the way, including most of the jewelry, had been melted down in accordance with practice. It's crucial to understand that, by comparison to other explorers and conquistadors, this was a huge haul. Just consider Ponce de Leon, for example. In his property in Puerto Rico, he accumulated in 13 years, from 1509 to 1521, just under 22,000 pesos worth of gold, 4,000 of which he sent to the king. In less than 1 year, Cortés was going to send the king 32,000 pesos, 8 times that amount. If Cortés needed to buy himself back into the king's good graces, he was sure as heck going to do it. Now, sometime in March 1520, Montezuma's favorite little page, Ortiguilla, went to see Cortés. He told him that Montezuma needed to talk to him right away. Ortiguilla added that he had noticed several secret discussions between Montezuma and his lords, which suggested that a plot might be at foot. Cortés went, with 4 other captains as well as the 2 interpreters, to see the emperor. Montezuma, that day, seemed to be a new man. His gods, so long silent, had now apparently told him to declare war on the Europeans, on the ground that they had stolen gold and other things. Montezuma said that since he had become fond of the Europeans, he wanted them to leave before his people attacked them. He offered Cortés himself 2 loads of gold and 1 for each of his men, sort of as a parting gift. Now, of course, in his statement, he made no mention at all of the lost god or lost leader who Cortés supposedly was, who disappeared in the past, nor the legend that he would return to rule the empire, nor did he speak of the oath that Cortés insisted that he took. He didn't even mention the King of Spain. Poof. All of that seems to have been forgotten. But why the change in Montezuma? We would have expected him to react when Cortés went to remove the idols, but he didn't. It seems that Montezuma's own people helped him find his backbone again. The Mexican people were insisting that Montezuma either expel or kill the Europeans. So I suppose he didn't so much as act as just bow to the public will. Montezuma now became insistent that Cortés leave Tenochtitlan. Now, one of the ironies of this whole year-long period is that both men, Cortés and Montezuma, recognize how it's in their best interest to resolve all this without bloodshed. Yet in the end, neither man is able to make that happen. Cortés responded to Montezuma that he would love to leave, but he had no ships. Montezuma countered by saying he would lend Cortés all his carpenters to build the ships. Cortés came back with something like, "Oh sure, we'll go, but you're coming with us." The notion of traveling to Spain forced Montezuma to once more pump the brakes. Whatever Cortés's plans were, they were abruptly upended early in April 1520. Word reached Cortés and Montezuma that a Spanish ship had arrived off the coast of Veracruz. Some men in the expedition believed that this was aid come from Spain as a result of the efforts by the men Cortés sent to argue his case before the king. But Cortés was more shrewd than that. He recognized that these reinforcements were just as if not more likely to have come from Governor Velázquez in Cuba. In which case, they weren't a pleasant surprise at all. The appearance of Paniflos de Narváez's fleet off the coast of Mexico in April 1520 was the consequence of the departure from there 9 months before of the 2 men Cortés had sent back to Spain. Now, those 2 conquistadors left for home on the Santa Maria de Concepcion, just out of the newly founded town of Veracruz. Their mission was to go back to Spain and persuade the young King Charles to recognize Cortés as governor and the captain general of the new territory, a territory which he had, of course, not yet conquered. They had been told by Cortés to go directly to Spain. Speed was essential. They had therefore determined to travel north of Cuba and then along the Gulf Stream. This route had been discovered 6 years ago, during Ponce de Leon's voyage to Florida. The plan was then to turn northeast and set sail across the ocean. This, actually very soon, would become the conventional way of traveling from Spain to Cuba and hence Mexico. But one of the 2 men on board, who had property in Cuba, convinced everyone else to stop. I mean, this wasn't totally out of the question. It was kind of more or less on the way. They stayed there for 3 days, having anchored on August the 23rd. During this stay, one of the servants caught a glimpse of the treasure which they were taking home to Spain. He exclaimed later that he had never seen such riches. Now, the gentleman in question was sworn to secrecy, but the idea that that was going to happen? No, never. It wasn't before long that word of the treasure trove of riches Cortés had accomplished and found in Mexico had reached Governor Velázquez. Governor Velázquez had just passed the first 6 months after Cortés had left Cuba really without complaint. Life had gone on. A few operations had found some deposits of gold, to the west of Havana. Then, a modest sugar harvest came in. More tobacco grew. The court at Santiago survived. The world, in other words, just kept on spinning. But then word reached Velázquez that Cortés had truly found something in Mexico. The amount of gold he was sending back to Spain put anything Velázquez was doing in Cuba to shame. Suddenly, Velázquez cared a lot about Cortés. He was angry. Here he had given this man everything he needed to launch a voyage of discovery in his name, and he took it all for himself. Ridiculous. Velázquez was going to put a stop to it ASAP. Initially, he sent out several ships to waylay Cortés's Spanish-bound messengers on the high seas, but they missed the mark. So Velázquez went straight to the source. He dispatched a man to Spain with letters to Bishop Fonseca, the man who had, for years, run the Spanish enterprises in the West Indies. Velázquez begged Fonseca to do whatever he could to thwart Cortés's designs. Velázquez also planned an expedition to destroy Cortés's little colony, but fate got in the way. In October, smallpox reached Cuba. It was the first real epidemic in the New World. By May 1519, nearly all the indigenous Tayanos on Santo Domingo were dead. By the end of that year, they were totally wiped out. By November, smallpox reached Cuba. Year 2, the population collapsed, as did the sugar production, which was dependent on Indian slave labor. All of this both slowed the initial creation of an expedition to stop Cortés, and then it supercharged it. How is that? Well, you see, suddenly in late 1519, everyone was desperate to get out of Cuba. Men were more than willing to risk everything to chase down Cortés. I mean, what did they have to lose? They were going to die in Cuba anyway. So Velázquez had his pick of captains, and he chose a man named Panfilio de Narváez. Narváez was a good choice. Just this past January, Narváez had gone to what is today Panama and executed the then errant governor. Narváez had lopped off Balboa's head and not thought twice about it. He was the perfect man for the job. Meanwhile, Portocarrero and Montejo, Cortés's two agents, had reached Spain. They arrived in October 1519 and were in Seville on November the 5th of that same year. They did not get the hero's welcome they expected. The treasure they brought was immediately confiscated. This time, Velázquez was 2 steps ahead. Diego Velázquez sent word to his personal chaplain in Spain to hold up Cortés's men and prevent their success. And he did just that. Luckily for Cortés and his men, though, Spain that winter was on the verge of rebellion. We talked about this in previous episodes, but this is during that period when the Spanish nobility, and especially the municipalities, the cities and the towns, were badly trying to extract major compromises from Charles V, who, for his part, just wanted to get out of Spain and back onto Germany. As a result of all this, Bishop Fonseca had been able to control Spanish policy in the New World, much as he had done under Ferdinand. By March 1519, he had put together a department within the all-powerful Council of Castile to deal with the West Indies. Fonseca, of course, would be in charge. But the flip side to the rebellion coin was that while the crown wanted consolidation, the towns, or procuradores, were seeking to influence royal policy more and more. And just as that was sort of holding back Fonseca's power, Cortés's men got a lucky break. It turned out that Hernán Cortés's father had a connection to Charles V. He knew his prior almoner, the person that he went to make absolution. So Cortés's men teamed up with his father to see if they could find a way around Bishop Fonseca. It helped, of course, that they had mountains of treasure to smooth over any rough edges. Now, by the time that Portocarrero and Montejo, now with Cortés's father, reached Barcelona, the court had left for Bruges. The emperor had, however, performed some important businesses relating to the Indies. He had, for example, heard Las Casas' account of the evils of the Spanish treatment of the natives in the Caribbean, which, even if it was a tenth as violent as Las Casas said it was, must have made a strong impression on him. Charles also issued a decree asking that the treasure, which Portocarrero and Montejo had brought from the New World, to be handed over to the Casa de la Contratación in Seville. Casa de la Contratación was the sort of department that was in charge of any and all expeditions and what they got from the New World. More importantly still, he even sent a friendly message to Cortés's emissaries, saying he was pleased to hear of their arrival, ordering them to go to court, the place where I shall be, and asked them to bring with them the Totonac Indians and to treat them well. Charles's moderate tone was a clear indication that Fonseca's power was waning. Cortés's men finally caught up with the royal court at Valladolid. They asked for the release of the funds they had brought from Veracruz, as well as their ship. Crucially, they also asked that Cortés be granted the title of governor and chief magistrate of this new territory, i.e. Mexico, until Cortés could finish conquering it. For really the first time, Cortés was giving an indication to the crown that he intended to conquer all of Mexico, not just settle the coast. While there is no definitive proof that Cortés's men or his father saw Charles V personally, it seems probable that they did. That's because, in the end, the Royal Council punted on the issue, and that was a very good thing for Hernán Cortés. They didn't give Cortés the titles he sought, but they did give him back his money to use as his emissaries saw fit in Spain. The Royal Council decided the wisest course of action was to wait until it could hear from both Cortés and Governor Velázquez. This was a huge win for Cortés, as it suggested he was on an even footing with the governor. It was as close to an outright victory for Cortés's friends as they were going to get. As for Charles, he probably never read the letters Cortés sent him. He did take them with him as he left Spain, along with all the treasure that constituted his royal fifth. As we know, he was going to need Mexico's wealth to buy the imperial crown in Germany. In Seville, Cortés's father would sell his son's recently returned ship, which was technically against Cortés's express orders. But it proved to be for the best. The money he got from the sale was enough to ship back significant and crucial supplies. Now back in Cuba, Velázquez was not about to sit around and wait for permission to deal with Cortés. As far as he was concerned, his man, Narváez, could now do that since Cortés had violated his express order. So, Narváez sailed from Cuba in March 1520. He set off as usual for the Yucatan and then followed the coast in Cortés's footsteps. Every group of natives he encountered were hostile, which, as Narváez himself correctly pointed out, was probably as the result of the way in which Cortés had treated them. Narváez made every effort to be kind to the Totonacs and others that he met as he traveled. Montezuma found out Narváez had reached Veracruz long before Cortés, and did not immediately tell him. However, in the end he found it impossible to keep Cortés from the secret of Narváez's arrival. Now, why did he keep it secret? Well, perhaps he thought Cortés would punish him if he discovered the news independently. Montezuma showed Cortés the painted cloths illustrating the new ships that had arrived, and urged him to leave Tenochtitlan. He said to Cortés that he could see that the Spaniards were not all united and did not all have the same lord. He pointed out now that there were many ships, so, quote, "You have no need to build ships. You can return together to Castile, and there need be no further excuses," end quote. Now, Cortés, nonplussed, replied that Castilians did have the same lord, but that the new people who arrived were probably bad people. They might be brigands, they might be robbers, they might be people who would bring bad luck to the land because they would steal whatever there was. Now, of course, Cortés knew very well who these people were. He immediately realized that the newcomers were much more likely agents of Governor Velázquez than people directly from Spain. Back in Veracruz, the man Cortés left in charge, Sandoval, took decisive action. He called together all the men and made them swear an oath to support no governor other than Hernán Cortés. Then he sent away all the sick and old men. In other words, he was preparing for a siege. Narvaez, for his part, sent a small party with letters addressed to the various members of Cortés's party in Veracruz, seeking to lure them away from the conquistador. Sandoval ordered this party arrested and sent directly to Tenochtitlan. When these men reached the capital, Cortés ordered them released, blaming the whole thing on Sandoval so that he could, as usual, look like the good guy. On top of that, he gave them a substantial quantity of gold as an enticement to change sides and as an indication of the wealth that could be had in Mexico. Narvaez might have some nice-sounding letters from Governor Velázquez, but Cortés, he had gold. It turned out the latter was much more effective at buying affections. Narvaez, in the meantime, sent one of his ships back to Cuba with an update for the governor. It seems that Cortés had indeed found a wealthy civilization. Their capital, he wrote, was in the interior of the island or continent, or whatever the heck this was. The men he talked to said it sounded like a modern Venice, which he couldn't believe, but he would see for himself soon enough. Now back in Tenochtitlan, Cortés debated what should be done about Narvaez. Given that Narvaez seemed uninterested in compromise, and based on his prior reputation of chopping people's heads off, the course seemed straightforward. Cortés declared, quote, "Death to Narvaez and to anyone who argues about the matter," end quote. Now, as the calendar turned to 1520, Hernán Cortés seemed to be in a weak position. He had a small force to begin with when he arrived in Mexico, and since then, he had divided that force into four. He had only around 200 men in Tenochtitlan. True, Montezuma and a few other major Mexican lords were his prisoners, but how long could that last? Easter Sunday, April the 8th, 1520, came and went. It was time to take decisive action. So Cortés set out for the coast in early May. Unwilling to lose what he had gained in Tenochtitlan, he left 120 men under the command of one Alvarado to keep order and keep Montezuma captive. Thus, he was only taking 80 conquistadors and a number of Tlaxcalans with him. This was a huge gamble. The men he was going to have to face absolutely understood firearms and horses. They were going to outnumber him, and they weren't going to be easily spooked. Cortés warmly embraced Montezuma before he left. The latter begged Cortés to let him help. He said he could send an army of 100,000 plus 30,000 porters. Surely, with those numbers, Cortés would prevail. Cortés told him all he needed was God. Still, as he left, Montezuma reminded Cortés that all he needed to do was send word, and Montezuma would send a massive force to aid him. Now, of course, this was the last thing Cortés wanted. Who knew what the Mexicans might realize they could do with a large army at hand? It wouldn't take long for someone to figure out they could just wipe out Cortés as well and be done with it. It was a risk Cortés couldn't take. Cortés set out to the sea over the same land route he took in getting to Tenochtitlan. As he marched and met with various Indian allies overland, Cortés realized that Montezuma knew about Navarrete long before he told him. Cortés was furious, and this would change his attitude towards the Mexican emperor after his return. As he marched, Cortés also distributed a significant amount of gold to his men. The goal was clear: keep everyone happy and loyal. Upon reaching the coast, Cortés sent an emissary demanding that Navarrete lay down his arms and submit to Cortés's authority. It was an imperious demand that had absolutely no chance of success. Cortés certainly knew this. He only sent the message to give himself legal justification for the military action he had already settled on. For a few days after Cortés reached the coast, messages went back and forth between the two camps. Cortés did everything he could to purchase the loyalty of Navarrete's men. According to one historian, quote, "The camp of Navarrete was soon awash with gold, believed to have come from Cortés." End quote. Now, neither side had any interest in compromise. All of these negotiations were merely maneuvering for a superior moral and legal position. All of this came to an end on May the 28th, 1520. That day, Cortés arranged his men into 5 companies for the battle to come. His plan was really simple: attack in the darkness and overwhelm Navarrete before he had a chance to respond. For his part, Navarrete knew what was coming, having declared open war on Cortés several days earlier. Still, Navarrete seems to have totally misjudged how far away Cortés was the evening going into the battle. And I mean that physically. Like, he didn't understand how close Cortés's army was to him. He expected the attack to come around dawn. But Cortés and his army were much closer than he realized. Even when his aide burst into Navarrete's tent and informed him Cortés was on the move, he didn't spring into action. Navarrete expected Cortés to pause before he attacked, and he was wrong. Navarrete had built his headquarters on top of the pyramid outside Capellan. Cortés's men moved in the darkness, silently dispatched the sentries at the base of the pyramid, and were practically overrunning the camp itself before anyone knew what was going on. Sandoval led the charge into Navarrete's tent. After a vicious struggle resulting in several deaths and many more maimings, they captured Navarrete. Navarrete, who had lost an eye in the battle, begged for a doctor, but Cortés told him, quote, "Traitor troublemaker, you have received better than your deserts," end quote. Then he sent him a doctor. They were both gentlemen, after all. The moment Navarrete surrendered, all his captains likewise capitulated. Cortés seized all kinds of booty, and the casualties were actually pretty high for the numbers involved. Navarrete lost 15 men, Cortés 2. Cortés then went on to dismantle Navarrete's nearby town of San Salvador, which hadn't even really started to grow yet. For once, Cortés could exhale. Velázquez had sent a significant expedition against him, and he had fended it off with relative ease. He didn't know it yet, but everything in Spain was also going according to plan. He had gambled, and he had won. Or so it would seem. Just as the dust settled in Veracruz, word reached Cortés from Tenochtitlan. The message was from Montezuma. Cortés needed to return to the capital at once. Alvarado, whom Cortés had left in charge, had killed and wounded many Indians at a festival which Cortés himself had given permission for. The city was in full-blown rebellion. If you've enjoyed the episode and would like additional content, as always, check out the links in the show notes. There's links there to the website, teaching materials, ad-free versions of the show, and Western Civ 2.0, full in the Peloponnesian Wars at this point, if you'd like to hear the whole thing over again.